Hi, so here we are again, getting into the real center of some of the topics that we are looking at in this course. And in this lecture, very short lecture, we will look at both gender and development. And I strongly recommend you as a first reading for this week. I mean, for class 3, there's multiple readings that I suggested. But the one of McEwan, I think it's particularly useful. It summarizes many of the discussions and criticisms there is, on the one hand, to feminism from global South countries, and to development also from global South countries and from post-colonial thinking. So I think that reading will help you very much understand some of the critical issues that we are trying to look at in this course. So we will get started by looking at the first interventions. As you might remember, after the Second World War is when we have the real development aid system getting established. We have lots of development interventions through either development agencies, bilateral agencies, embassies, also different institutions from the north carry out different development interventions in the south. And at that time, the trend when it came to women and to try to design interventions for women was to consider them in the role as wives and mothers. In a similar way to Rostow's theory that it was supposed that all countries would go through a linear process towards development, the idea was, the underlying or implicit idea in many of the interventions was that women in developing countries would sooner or later benefit from development interventions. So at that time, there was not a real looking or addressing power relations between men and women in developing countries, and it was considered more or less that the interest of men and women was the same. This was soon enough criticized by women working within the development sector. For example, we have Bostrup's book here in this slide that it's about women's role in economic development, and she very much criticizes the role that women were given in the agricultural economy in this type of post-colonial, post-war interventions. She criticized something that nowadays in some projects can be criticized too, no? Not all of them, but there's some projects that still have these characteristics in the development sector. She criticized that women were given a role mainly within the agriculture sector, but within the subsistence sector, and they were often left outside the old type of trainings and more modern type of agricultural interventions. And this obviously made them lose status and power relative to men. And while criticizing this, she also questions the way in which these post-war institutions intervene in certain countries, not understanding the more complex structures and division of work between men and women. In fact, before I forget, one important point that often is criticized from the feminists from global South countries is the division between public and private, as is done from a Western perspective. You will see this point in one of the readings that you have for this class, but this is a central point that it's important for you to take into account, because it's also something that comes well reflected in some of the development interventions that are also criticized by post-colonial feminisms. Okay, but this, we are going back into, this is the 70s, and the approach at that time, in a nutshell, how development agencies treated women could be summarized under the concept of women in development, WID. You will see this acronym in some of the readings, and it's important for you to understand when this acronym is there, what is it about. And in fact, this one is very much related to what we discussed in another lecture, which is the first wave feminist thinking that was more concerned about the economic integration of women. Yes, so this is an approach that is concentrating on a liberal feminist ideology, and where the main concern of the development strategies at this time was looking at women's productive role, ensuring that the disadvantages that women had in the productive sector were minimized, and looking at all this from a modernization perspective, thinking that if women as individuals were given the right tools, the right productive economic integration possibilities, they would be able to produce change. This is what this approach would be in a nutshell. Criticisms to this approach soon emerge. In the late 70s, they consolidate, and the same criticisms that were done to the modernization theory are done to this approach, which is like a sister of the approach, saying that not necessarily all there's a linear path to development. Also, the thing that it's mostly questioned, perhaps the most central questioning that is done to this approach, is the same one that we were discussing about the first wave feminism, which is that it did not question power relations between genders. Also, the cost of focusing too much on the productive role and leaving behind the reproductive role, and in doing so, neglecting certain important interests of women in the domestic sphere. So again, this is an approach that it's criticized for not looking into the more complex construct of patriarchy, of how women are subordinated in a patriarchal system, and not really paying attention to the limits of economic independence, because this approach, the WID approach, focused so much on economic independence without really understanding that economic independence in a patriarchal system where women are really not empowered at a conscious level, at a social level, at a home level, in their power relations and multiple dimensions, does not bring about real empowerment. Okay. In response to this, the failures or the limits of this approach, we have the gender and development approach, which emerges in the 1980s and precisely takes all the criticisms, the weak points of the other approach, and to begin with, starts ensuring that interventions are not just focusing on women at their productive role or their reproductive role, but rather at a more holistic perspective. It rejects, therefore, the public-private split. It recognizes the importance of looking at women's interests in both the production and at the reproduction levels. And it acknowledges the need to design interventions that challenge the oppression that women live within the private sphere. Women are also, remember that at this time, the rights-based approach was also very much gaining terrain. And as opposed to the needs-based approach, the rights-based approach very much focused on the idea that people were not just beneficiaries of development, they were agents. For real transformation to take place, there was a criticism to development interventions that tried to just deliver change. And the idea also from this gender and development perspective, more in tune with the rights-based approach that we discussed in a previous lecture, was to ensure that women were not treated as passive recipients, but as agents of change. So in a nutshell, this new approach defies the existing gender relations in society. An author that you may have come across in the readings, and it's important to take into account, Molinet, she distinguishes, and it's something that then it's operationalized in many tools that development agencies use. She distinguishes between practical gender needs and strategic gender needs. So practical gender needs are those that, if met, women would have improved their lives, but this would have not necessarily changed their subordinated position in society. While strategic gender interests, it's focusing at other aspects, like, for example, gender-based violence, sexual reproductive rights, other things that speak more of how power is distributed between the sexes. So as you see, as time goes by, I'm moving more also towards the 90s and till today, basically, there is an increasing concern to ensure that equity, empowerment has different dimensions, and the design of interventions, even, for example, if you review afterwards more in detail the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets, are increasingly more complex and are increasingly more political and touching upon things that are not necessarily material. Yes, this again in opposition to a needs-based approach that was looking at economic and very simple aspects related with poverty, and not more structural and profound ones. Okay. Now, as we have started mentioning in the readings and in previous recordings, both feminist, classic feminism or Western feminism, as some of our authors mention it in the literature, is criticized by what it's called post-colonial feminist perspectives, Black feminism, that says, okay, both development and gender conceived from a Western feminist perspective are not taking into account the interests of women in certain countries, Black women, indigenous women, and there's a big challenge from this perspective, the post-colonial feminist perspective, to other to these classic Western feminists, saying these women, these white women in Europe or in USA are not representing us. And it is about time that there is at least the place for multiple voices. And if we continue in this way, the legacy also of colonialism will not disappear from either development practice nor from gender conceptions. So one of the first movements that questions this and represents women from Latin America, Africa, and South Asia is this one that it's done, but there's multiple others, and they start focusing on specific regional situations, on also how, on intersectionality issues, and saying, okay, there's aspects that affect women in certain countries much more and have to do with ecological issues, have to do with the way the world is organized, the position that countries occupy within the world system economically, and this movement, like other movements that still are very much alive today, but with different names, question any type of development intervention that is so narrow-minded, that only represents an understanding from white women in the North about how to bring development to women placed in different parts of the world and affected by multiple discriminations. Okay, so just to finalize, I strongly advise you to listen to this podcast that it's called Gender at Work, episode 16, which is by the same authors as one of the readings, Aruna Rao and Joan Sandler. And it poses very interesting questions about some of the limitations there has been within the attempt to mainstream gender in the development institutions, and some of the contradictions that development institutions face as they try to move externally with ensuring equity, gender equity, and some of the contradictions they face within. So the speakers pose themselves very interesting questions. Some of them I will post in Canvas so that we can start having an exchange about some of the thoughts that you're having on this. And of course, if there's any doubt about the lecture so far, take the chance to post any question by email or also use Canvas. Any form is fine for me, or if you need to have a synchronous session with me, we can arrange one. Otherwise, we will be meeting on Thursday, as some of you have already confirmed. I'm just waiting for another confirmation to tell you exactly the time. Okay, have a good week. Thank you. Bye-bye.